the first 6 chapters were historical, right? Speaking of like what literally transpired in the life of Daniel and everything that we read. Obviously, there was a few dreams and interpretations that he had to give with those dreams. We saw a lot of things happening. And one of the things that we get from those first 6 chapters is a big encouragement going into chapters 7 through 12. Because in the first 6 chapters, God shows his faithfulness. Right? He shows his faithfulness to his people. He shows his faithfulness as a God, as a reigning sovereign God over every single event in life and even the big things in life, right? And the fact that he had in his hand the empire and the kingdom of Babylon. And Babylon was the greatest empire to have ever existed, right? Now, Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king of that empire, was the greatest king to have ever existed. When I say the greatest, I'm not talking about like he was like the best king. Obviously, I think, David would probably rank up there. But the greatest in the sense of the power and the authority that he had as a single man here on earth, he was the greatest. Remember, the Bible in the Old Testament calls him specifically the King of Kings. Now, remember, that was a lowercase k. So he was the best of the kings in regards to all the kings of the earth. Now, obviously, God is the ultimate King of kings and reigns and has authority over everything. But the point being is that even with Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon, that God was in control. Right? He allowed certain things to happen. He gave authority. He gave power to Babylon. He gave that to Nebuchadnezzar. And he even took it away. Very simply, just like that. Right? And for 7 years, Nebuchadnezzar became as a beast of the field until he really recognized that it was the kingdom of heaven that ruled, and that was the greatest. So he had to be humbled to the point that he had to recognize that. Once he recognized that, God put him back into his original position. He restored his mind. He restored him back into his position. Again, what is this doing? It's showing us that God is in control and that he's faithful. No matter what world events happen, no matter what kingdom, no matter what nation, no matter what president or king is in control, God is ultimately in control. He knows what's happening, he allows what's happening, and he has authority over everything. And so when we get into these chapters of 7 through 12, they're apocalyptic, right? They uncover, they reveal what is to come. Now, some of it, as we're going to read in chapter 8 tonight, has already happened. Some of it is a prelude to what is going to happen, specifically with what we studied in chapter 7, right? Things that haven't happened yet. And now, as we finish chapter 7, what I wanted to really encourage us with, because we see a lot of things that seem really daunting and dark and depressing, and like it's going to be hard. And one of the things that we need to understand that life is hard no matter what as a human being, right? It is. But for Christians, we have to understand that persecution's going to come, hardship's going to come. That if you are, as a Christian, in the end times, there's going to be hardship. For the Jews, there's going to be hardship. That the Antichrist is going to rise up and he's going to persecute. And he says here in verse 25, that he shall persecute the saints of the Most High. Right? He even talks about at one point where he's going to basically just continue pushing them. And it's going to be hard. And it can be scary. It can be discouraging if we don't have the right perspective. Right? Think of it this way. In 2020, right, when COVID broke out, a lot of you guys were a lot younger. That was 4 years ago. Any person who just constantly watched the news probably lived in fear, right? Because what you focus on and what you bring in can really change how you perceive things and your demeanor and how you look at things. And so for those people who just consume themselves with all the negative stuff, it causes fear. But if we have a good perspective, we don't consume ourselves with the wrong things, and we actually consume ourselves with the right things, and understanding, again, that God is always in control, that he's warning us of these things to come, then what do we have to fear? But if we constantly look at world events and we just look through the lens of our earthly eyes, it's gonna be scary, right? It is. I mean, the fact that we're on the brink of World War III, the way that our economy is going, the way that our country is going, how insanely divided it is, the anti-Semitism that is uprising. Like, a lot of this stuff can be very, very scary. How things are becoming, that we're wrong or right and right is wrong. If we look at it through the lens of our earthly eyes, we'll be fearful. And it's scary. But if we look at it through the perspective of God and His Word and the truth, then we can have comfort and we can have hope. And I think that's how we need to look. So let's look at this. We'll try to finish chapter 7. If you guys remember in chapter 7, Daniel gets a vision of these 4 beasts, right? And the 3 beasts, the first 3 beasts were likened unto an animal that we could all understand. And this was going back to his original interpretation in chapter 2 with the statue. I'm not going to get into this because we've spent so much time on it already. But it represents kingdoms, and then we are in kings and kingdoms, and then we get to the 4th beast, which was something that he couldn't describe, and it was horrible, it was horrendous. And on that beast had 10 horns, right? And of those 10 horns, 3 came up, and out of those 3 was one, there was 10 horns, 3 got broken down, cut off, and 1 tiny horn comes up. It's the other horn. And as we learned, as we studied through chapter 7, that other horn that had the eyes of a man and spoke pompous words is the picture of the Antichrist to come. Right? And we talked about all those details and how that's going to work and who it is, and not who it is, but who the 3 horns represented, who the little horn represented. And we finished last week in verse 25. So let's read verses 26, 27, and 28. And then we'll jump into chapter 8. It says in verse 26, "But the court shall be seated, and they shall take away his dominion to consume and destroy it forever. Then the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people, the saints of the Most High. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him." This is the end of the account. "As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly troubled me, and my countenance changed, and I kept the matter in my heart." So we see some of the things that have happened last week, what the Antichrist is going to try to do. Multiple things. He's going to subdue 3 kings. We don't know exactly who those are. He's going to speak against the Most High, against God, the pompous words. It's going to be heretical. He's going to try and change the times and the laws, right? We talked about what that could look like. And then the saints are going to be under his dominion or domination, I should rather say, for time and times and half a time, which we saw at the end of verse 25. And so it seems dark and it seems bleak, but in the end, God is going to prevail because God is in control and God has all authority under heaven. And it says again in verse 26, "The court shall be seated," because it started with the court, as God is going to judge righteously. "They shall take away his dominion," so he no longer has any dominion. And this little horn, the Antichrist, is going to be consumed and destroyed forever. "Then the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people and the saints of the Most High. And his kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him." And God is going to establish his kingdom, and the saints will be a part of that. And that's an encouraging thing for us. That God is going to judge the nations, that God's kingdom is going to triumph in the end, and that we are a part of that kingdom. We're a part of that kingdom. Have you guys ever seen Lord of the Rings? Raise your hand if you have not. Okay, go home and watch all of them back to back to back. There's 3, but watch the extended versions. Or you can read the book. How many of you guys have read the book? Books, I should say. Okay. So the author, J.R.R. Tolkien, he was a devout Christian. And you can see the themes of Christianity within the movies and the books. It's not overt, but you can see it. And it really is it's probably one of the best movies ever made, I'm not going to lie. You genuinely need, get out of here. You genuinely need to watch it. But the point is this, because I want to get to this point. There is a hobbit in the movie. He's basically the main character. His name's Frodo. He's given the Ring of Power, and he is given the responsibility to destroy it to save Middle-earth. And at one point in the movie, in a moment of fear, after watching for 10 hours of it, he starts to complain. He complains to Gandalf, who's a wizard, who's a good wizard, and he says this. He says, "I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish none of this had happened." And Gandalf's reply was this: "So do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us." And I love that, because though we can be frightened by the world events and everything that's happening before us, like Daniel was when he saw the visions, we see at the end of verse 28, it says his thoughts greatly troubled him and his countenance changed. But what we have to be encouraged by is that, again, God is in control, and that he will strengthen us and he will enable us to go through anything that we have to face. Yeah, we may not want to do it, like Frodo said. I wish it would never have happened. But like Gandalf said, it's not something that you and I can decide. But what we can decide is that we will continue going forward, and that we will stand, and that we will be standing in the end. And just like Paul encourages us that anytime we go through spiritual battle, he says, look, I don't need you. You are victorious. You don't need to go and win the battle. You already are victorious, no matter what transpires in life. And all you have to do in the end is stand. You have to endure. Because the end of evil is certain. It's going to happen. God has already said. God has already ordained. And if you truly believe in God, then you know without a shadow of a doubt that he has ultimate authority over everything. And if he said that he's won, if he said that evil is going to be gone away with in the end, well, then we trust that. Jesus tells us, and he promises us in Matthew 24:13, he says, "He who endures to the end shall be saved." So you're not going to be spared from hardship. You're not going to be spared from hard times when it comes to evil and the ways of this world and the things that transpire. But you are given strength and endurance. You are given the things beyond which you think you can endure, he will allow and give to you. And this was even after the disciples came to him that Jesus promised this, because the disciples' question to him was, "Tell us when these things will be, and what the sign of your coming and of the end of the age." And Jesus speaks on many of things. He speaks on how the love of many is going to grow cold, and how it's going to be hard, and there's going to be persecution. But he says again, "He who endures to the end shall be saved." What a great encouragement. Because again, God is in control, and he's has all authority. All right, chapter 8. Let's stand and read. This is a fun chapter. How many of you guys like history? I asked you this before. Okay, cool. A lot of history in this book, chapter. Daniel chapter 8, verse 1. "In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that appeared to me the first time. I saw in the vision, and it so happened while I was looking, that I was in Shushan, the citadel, which is the province of Elam, and I saw the vision that I was by the river Ulai. Then I lifted up my eyes, and I saw, and there, standing beside the river, was a ram which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward, so that no animal could withstand him, nor was there any that could deliver from his hand, but he did according to his will and became great. And as I was considering, suddenly a male goat came from the west across the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. Then he came to the ram that had 2 horns, which I had seen standing beside the river, and ran at him with furious power. And I saw him confronting the ram, and he was moved with rage against him, attacked the ram, and broke his 2 horns. And there was no power in the ram to withstand him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled him. And there was no one that could deliver the ram from his hand. Therefore, The male goat grew very great, but when he became strong and large, the large horn was broken, and in place of it 4 notable ones came up toward the 4 winds of heaven. And out of one of them came a little horn which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. And it grew up to the hosts of heaven, and it cast down some of the hosts and some of the stars to the ground and trampled them. He even exalted himself as high as the prince of the hosts, and by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. Because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices, and he cast truth down to the ground. And he did all this and prospered. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that certain one who was speaking, "How long will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgression of desolation, the giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot?" And he said to me, 42,300 days, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. Here's the interpretation of that vision. Then it happened when I, Daniel, had seen the vision, was seeking the meaning, that suddenly there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, who called and said, "Gabriel, make this man understand the vision." So he came near where I stood, and when he came I was afraid and fell on my face, but he said to me, "Understand, son of man, that the vision refers to the time of the end." Now, as he was speaking with me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground, but he touched me and stood me right upright. And he said, "Look, I am making known to you what shall happen in the latter time of the indignation, for at the appointed time the end shall be. And the ram which you saw, having the 2 horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia. And the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. And the large horn that is between its eyes is the first king. As for the broken horn and the 4 that stood up in its place, 4 kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but not with its power. And in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, a king shall arise, having fierce features, who understands sinister schemes. His power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. He shall destroy fearfully, and he shall prosper and thrive, and he shall destroy the mighty and also the holy people. Through his cunning he shall cause deceit to prosper under his rule, and he shall exalt himself in his heart, and he shall destroy many in their prosperity, and he shall even rise against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without human means. And the vision of the evenings and mornings, which was told, is true. Therefore seal up the vision, for it refers to many days in the future. And I, Daniel, fainted and was sick for days. And afterward I arose and went about the king's business. And I was astonished by the vision, but no one understood it. You guys can grab a seat. What a really interesting dream. What a really interesting interpretation. Now, as we go through this, I think a lot of it is going to be review from what we already learned in chapter 2 and chapter 7. Right, how we've already learned of the kingdoms that were to arise and which kingdoms overtook these kingdoms and so forth. And if you remember going back to chapter 2, we had the statue with the 4 different kingdoms that were represented. The very first one with the head and the gold was Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar, right? The second one was the torso with the arms, speaking of Medo-Persia. And then the lower half of the torso was Greece with the bronze material. And then the bottom half, which was the iron, and the iron mixed with clay with the feet, that was a representation of Rome. And we've studied this as we've gone through chapter 2, chapter 7, and now chapter 8. And we're seeing again more details to what is going to transpire after Daniel's life, but way before our lives. And so this is why I say in chapter 8, these things have already transpired, and it's already written in history. It's written within Scripture as what's to come, but it's already happened for us. And we have history even to prove this. So chapter 7, it presented the history of the times of the Gentiles, from the Babylonian Empire until the second coming of Christ to establish his kingdom on earth. We saw this, the rise of the Antichrist, and then God casting him into the lake of fire and then establishing his kingdom. But the 8th chapter here is going to introduce Israel, right, in relation to the Gentiles. Because what we actually see happening, we don't see this in Scripture, but if you do your research, is that Daniel has been writing in Aramaic to speak to the Gentiles, but now in chapter 8, he's reverting back to Hebrew. So he's writing in Hebrew at this point on, because the subject matter here relates to Israel. And chapter 8 is Daniel's vision of this ram and this goat. So now we have another representation. It's a more detailed revelation of Medo-Persia and Greece and those empires and how they relate to Israel. So in verse 1, it says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of King of Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that appeared to me the first time." So the 3rd year of the reign of the king of Belshazzar is about 551 BC. It's 2 years after the events of chapter 7. Right? He's already said that one vision has already appeared to me the first time. This is the second one. And this vision occurred towards the end of the Babylonian Empire. Okay? Verse 2, he says, "I saw in the vision, and so happened while I was looking, that I saw Shushan, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in the vision that I was by the river," I got to remember how to pronounce this, Ulai. So 2 years after Daniel saw the dream and the vision of the 4 beasts arising from the sea, he has this one. But this one takes place in a place that he actually recognizes. It's in the citadel of Shushan, or Susa is another name for it, which is the capital of the Persian Empire. And today it's known as southwestern Iran. And so this was a city where the Persian king's throne was. And actually the events of Esther and the beginning of Nehemiah is where this takes place as well. So Daniel, what's interesting about this is if you see in verse 2, he says, "I saw in the vision, so it happened while I was looking that I was in Shushan." He says, "And I saw in the vision that I was by the river." So what's interesting is that Daniel is seeing this vision, but he's seeing himself in the vision, right? And he's seeing it from the perspective from the king's citadel. And the citadel is a royal residence or a palace, a place of strong fortification. He sees himself standing beside the river or the canal. And it says in verse 3 that he lifted his eyes and he saw, and there standing beside the river was a ram, which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. So every time that there's always been 2 of something, and obviously we already get the answer in verse 20 that this is the Medo-Persian Empire, but every time that there's 2 of something, it always represents this empire because there was 2 of them. There was the Media and there was Persia. And when we talked about it in chapter 7, it was, what was it, the bear? Was it the bear that was lifted up higher on one side? Right? Because you have these 2 empires that were combined in one, but one was greater than the other, speaking of the Persians. And so we see now here in verse 3 that there were 2 horns, right? But again, one was higher than the other. The one that was higher than the other that came up last is the Persian Empire because it was the more powerful of the 2 empires. Again, speaking of in Daniel 7 verse 5, where the bear was raised up on one side because Persia was more dominant. And actually, if you do research, historians will say from the 4th century on that the ancient symbol of the Persian Empire was actually a ram. And when they would go out to battle, the empire would wear a ram's head, like a jeweled ram's head, when he went out for war. So in verse 4, he sees this ram, and he sees the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward. So the ram represents who again? Who? Medo-Persia, right? So he sees this ram. It's pushing westward, northward, and southward so that no animal could withstand him, nor was there any that could deliver from his hand, but he did according to his will, and he became great. And if you look at history, the Medo-Persian Empire, after it took over Babylon, it started in the east, and it expanded in the same 3 directions: westward, northward, and southward. So it eventually covered modern countries like Iraq, Jordan, Israel, Egypt, Turkey, and parts of Greece. So in verse 5, he says, "I was considering, suddenly a male goat came from the west, and across the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. Now again, we don't have to guess who this represents, because Gabriel tells us in the interpretation, this is the Greek Empire. And who was the leader of that Greek Empire? Alexander the Great, right? Alexander the Great. Now, he says that this male goat, it comes across the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground. What is one of the things that we learned about when it came to the Greek Empire? Is that when they conquered, did they conquer slowly over time, or did Alexander the Great conquer really, really quick? It was insanely fast, conquering the whole known earth within a matter of 3 to 4 years. That is absolutely nuts. And so when we see this picture and this vision, the symbol here is that if he's not touching the ground, it's a symbol of him being fast. Right? If you guys have ever seen like a cheetah run, it almost looks like they don't touch the ground. And so again, this goat comes across the whole earth without touching the ground, and the goat had notable horn between his eyes. Now, Alexander the Great is this notable horn. Again, he conquers the world within 3 to 4 years. And part of the reason that the Greeks were able to conquer, and part of the reason was because of Alexander the Great and his brilliance when it came to his military tactics. Right? The things that he came up with and the things that he implemented to overtake the Persian army was absolutely phenomenal. He uses, it's this term called phalanx, and it's that tactical formation. You guys have seen this in movies, where basically they stand, where soldiers stand basically armed very heavily, and they stand shoulder to shoulder, right? And you've got, ranks of them deep, different, like more rows than you can count. But you've got the front with like the shields, you've got the ones behind with the spears, and you guys know what I'm talking about? I'm trying to explain that without showing you a visual. But he came up with that. And that proved very decisive, even with the massive number of Persia's army. And he overtook them. So this little horn, again, is Alexander the Great, the goat being the Greek Empire. So in verse 6, it says, "Then the goat came to the ram that had 2 horns, which I had seen standing beside the river, and ran at him with furious power. And I saw him confronting the ram, and he was moved with rage against him, attacked the ram, and broke its 2 horns. And there was no power in the ram to withstand him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled him, and there was no one that could deliver the ram from his hand. Therefore the male goat grew very great, but when he became strong, the large horn was broken, and in place of its 4 notable ones came up toward the 4 winds of heaven." So what we see transpiring is, again, Alexander the Great overtaking the Persian army, with ferocity, with speed, with intensity. And then what we see in verse 8 is that he starts to grow very great. And we see this with the Greek Empire. I mean, they basically overtook the whole world. It grew really great. It became really strong. And it says the large horn was broken. So this horn now that's on this goat is now broken. So this horn symbolizes Alexander the Great. So something negative happens. Well, if you didn't know, which I've told you before, but there's a lot to consume here, is that Alexander the Great, he died really, really young. Anyone know what age he died at? Yeah, in his 30s. He was 32. 32 years old is when Alexander died. And when he died, which we talked about before because this was in the other visions as well, is that his empire was then divided amongst his 4 generals. He dies in 323 BC at the age of 32, actually in Babylon in Nebuchadnezzar's palace, but he was so young that his own sons were young. And so there was confusion about who would come up after him and take his throne, but eventually his kingdom was split into 4 parts, or what we would say 4 notable horns, right, which was his generals. And so these 4 generals began 4 dynasties. And we see this actually happening in verse 22 as Gabriel is interpreting for us. He says, "As for the broken horn and the 4 that stood up in its place, 4 kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but not with its power." And so in verse 9, Daniel says, "And out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land." Now, as we look at verses 9 through 15, it's going to cover this little horn. And as we were studying through chapter 7, there was another little horn, right? And that little horn represented the Antichrist. And if we look at it in context, that whole chapter was end times. It wasn't the future. It was prophetic, but it still hasn't even come to pass yet. So now as we look at this little horn, and it displaces the single horn on the goat, it's actually not the same as the little horn that came out of the 10 horns of the 4th beast in chapter 7. This is Antiochus. You guys ever heard of Antiochus? This is who this whole chapter, the rest of this chapter, is going to be about. He ruled Syria from 175 to 164 BC. And the capital city of Antioch was actually named after him. And if you didn't know, this is a fun fact, that the very first Christians who were called Christians was in the city of Antioch. And so there are similarities between the little horn in chapter 7 and chapter 8, but the differences are vastly significant. Because the 4th kingdom in chapter 7 is Rome, while the goat in chapter 8 is not Rome. The Messianic kingdom in chapter 7 will be erected after the final world empire, while this is not true of the goat in chapter 8. Again, this is not end times, but it is future for the Israelites, for Daniel. But it's something that has already transpired in its history for us. Antiochus, he was called I don't know how to pronounce this, Epiphanes, if I can say that right, by his friends, which means illustrious one, but by the Jews, he was called, and I don't know if I can pronounce this either, Epimanes, which was the madman. And based on history, he did not like that. Like, that was a big insult to him. And so what happens with him is that he comes into rise, and he comes and he reigns. And what we see in verse 9 is that this little horn, Antiochus, that he grew exceedingly great towards the south, east, and towards the glorious land. Well, what does that represent? It represents this, that he conquered Egypt, which was in the south. He conquered Armenia, which was in the east. And then he made his way to Israel, which is the glorious land. And what we know about Antiochus is that he went to Jerusalem, which is Israel, in 167 BC. He took the city. He massacred the Jews. This is all in history. You can look at it. As he does so, he plunders the temple in Jerusalem, and he forced the temple to be the temple of the Greek god Zeus. He erects an altar, and he defiles the temple by offering a pig on the altar. And the remaining Jews who were not massacred, they were forced to eat of these sacrifices, and the death penalty was for Jews who had circumcised or who would circumcise their sons. Basically, all of this comes upon God's chosen people in Israel, and Antiochus is the one who does this. This little horn comes and does this. And let's read more about Antiochus in verses 10 and on. It says, "And it grew, this little horn, up to the hosts of heaven, and it cast down some of the hosts and some of the stars to the ground and trampled them. He even exalted himself as high as the prince of the hosts, and by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. Because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices, and he cast truth down to the ground, and he did all this and prospered." So we see this little horn growing in its greatness and its power. Antiochus, that happened with him. His power grew. He was throwing down kings left and right, and he began to challenge God himself which is represented here, or who is represented here as the Prince of the hosts. That is who God is. He's the Lord of hosts. He's the Prince. And so he exalts himself in verse 11 as high as the Prince of the hosts. Last time we saw that happening was with Lucifer, and we see how that did not go too well. Anytime that our pride gets in the way, we know that pride brings destruction, right? And a haughty spirit before the fall. And this is going to be a big fall for Antiochus. But he starts to elevate himself as God. And even to the point that in 169 BC, that the coins that were minted by his kingdom, they had the title, King Antiochus, God Manifest. And he starts to attack God's people, to defile his temple, and attacking God himself. In this vision, it shows the rebellion and the transgression against God. In Psalm 24:10, the Bible refers to God as the Lord of hosts. God is this Prince of hosts. And again, Antiochus elevates himself into the place of God. He made laws that changed the religious habits of the people within the kingdom. He did not destroy the temple, but he did tear down the altar. Right? Like I told you earlier, he built his own altar. He erected his own altar, defiling it by sacrificing pigs within the temple. This act would be known to them as an abomination of desolation. And he starts to substitute the lie of paganism for the real revealed truth of God's word and trust to the Jewish people. It's known within history that he made it so that everyone had to get rid of the Torah, the scrolls, to be destroyed. And this is represented here in verse 12 when it says that he casts truth down to the ground. And we're going to see the same thing happening, I think, in the end times with the Antichrist, when he's going to start casting the very truth of God's word and making people believe that it's not truth and that there is another truth, the same way that Antiochus was doing here. So in verse 13, Daniel says, "Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that certain one who was speaking, 'How long will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifice and the transgression of desolation, giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot?' And so he said to me, For 2,300 days, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed." At this point, this is so amazing to me. At this point, Daniel, he hears two heavenly beings talking to one another, and they're talking about what's transpiring here on earth. They're seeing it happen, and they're talking about it. And one of them's asking how long the temple is going to be desecrated and defiled. And the other one answers very exactly and says, 2,300 days. That's how long. Well, the holy heavenly beings here are angels. And they're speaking of the violation, the desecration that Antiochus is raining upon the temple in Jerusalem. Now, these 2,300 days, the days here literally means evening and mornings. And there's a couple ways to look at this. There's one interpretation which is completely falsely wrong, and I'll tell you why, because it's just a guess. For some, they believe that for 2,300 days, they thought it meant 2,300 years. There was a guy named William Miller who thought this. And he thought starting from 457 BC, nobody knows why. And he figured if you add 2,300 years to that Christ would then return in 1843. Did he? No. Well, it didn't happen. So they actually recalculated and they said, hey, we got it wrong. It's actually 1844. It's next year. Well, when that didn't happen, there was a lady who came along and said that Jesus really did come in 1844, but only those on the inside knew about it. And this is how the Seventh-day Adventists started. So obviously that interpretation is dumb. And there's two other interpretations that we can look at that make more sense. If you take it as 2,300 days, that's a little over 6 years, if you do the math. This is about the same time that Antiochus began oppressing the Jews and replacing their high priest with his own high priest until the time that Judas Maccabeus cleansed the temple. Or you can look at it this way, that some take the 2,300 days, which is literally morning and evenings, and divide that by 2 because it's morning and evenings to come up with 1,150 days, about 3 years. And this would describe the time from when Antiochus desecrated the temple, and not just starting to begin to, what's the word I'm trying to look for? Oppress the Jews, but the time that he actually desecrates the temple with his pig until Judas Maccabeus cleanses the temple. So either way you look at it, I believe one of those has to be what it is, and it transpires as such because on December 25th of 165 BC is the exact day that the temple was actually cleansed and rededicated. And this is the holiday that is celebrated by the Jews every year. Anybody know the holiday? Hanukkah. And the Bible refers to it as the Feast of Dedication. So in verse 15 through 26, we get the interpretation of this vision. It says, "Then it happened when I, Daniel, had seen the vision and was seeking the meaning, that suddenly there stood before me one having the appearance of a man, and I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, who called and said, 'Gabriel, make this man understand the vision.' So Gabriel comes before him." Gabriel we have seen before in the New Testament as he came before John the Baptist's father, Zacharias, and also Mary. Right? Gabriel is a messenger of God from what we see. In verse 17, "He came near when I stood, but when he came, I was afraid and fell on my face. But he said to me, 'Understand, son of man, that the vision refers to the time of the end.' Now as he was speaking with me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground, but he touched me and stood me upright. And he said, 'Look, I am making known to you what shall happen in the latter time of the indignation, for at the appointed time the end shall be.'" He says, "I'm making known to you what shall be happen. There will be a time of indignation ahead." This vision is for the Jews so that they can prepare and that they can know that there is difficult times ahead, that there's going to be continued difficult times ahead. And even though their time in Babylon was almost over, there would be more difficult times ahead, and they would be facing Antiochus. They didn't know exactly, but they had to be prepared for something bad to happen. And obviously, this is not a comforting lesson to hear, but like we've been encouraged with, it depends how we look at it. And if we are prepared, we need to be prepared to experience difficult times. Yeah, everything right now might be fine and dandy, but we have to be prepared. We see all throughout Scripture from the beginning to the end that the Christians have to face some type of persecution and hardship. In verse 20 it says, "The ram which you saw, having the 2 horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia, and the male goat is the kingdom of Greece, and the large horn that is between its eyes is the first king. And as for the broken horn and the 4 that stood up in its place, 4 kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but not with its power. In the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, a king shall arise, having fierce features, who understands sinister schemes." This is representing of Antiochus. "His power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. He shall destroy fearfully, and he shall prosper and thrive, but he shall destroy the mighty and also the holy people." So Antiochus, he was powerful, but why was he powerful? Because God allowed him, and God uses him as an instrument for his divine discipline upon the Jews. God always uses the bad for good. And so in the same way, we're going to see the future Antichrist. He's going to form alliances with other nations. He's going to achieve world influence, and he will attack the Jews. In verse 25, "Through his cunning, he shall cause deceit to prosper under his rule, and he shall exalt himself in his heart, and he shall destroy many in their prosperity, and he shall even rise against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without human means." Every single one of these earthly kings and kingdoms always rises and falls. And God's kingdom and God himself never falls. Is never broken. So Antiochus, he falls under this principle of dual fulfillment. He represents actually a real person that comes to pass after Daniel's time, but he's also a type of the coming of the Antichrist. Now Antiochus is described as such in the last four verses in verse 23, 24, and 25, the past three verses. One, in verse 23, it says that he should have fierce features. Now, it's understood that he had a really scary face. Like he was scary to look at. He had a presence that reflected inner strength and made people afraid. The second thing that we see about Antiochus, that he was a master of intrigue, right? It said he understands sinister schemes. This is what he was known for. People called him artfully clever. The third thing that we see in verse 24 is that he was strong, but not by his own power, right? It says his power shall be mighty, but not by his own. In verse 4, not verse 4, the fourth point is that he causes astounding devastation and destruction in verse 24. The fifth point is that he destroys mighty men and holy people. We see this with him attacking and massacring many of the Jews within Jerusalem. In verse 25, we see the sixth point is that he is deceitful. He's deceitful. And Antiochus was deceitful. In verse 25, we see him that he considers himself superior. He was arrogant. In verse 25, we also see that he comes up against God, the Prince of Princes. We see this with him basically calling himself the manifest God upon his money and his coins that he minted. And the ninth point that we see is in the last part of verse 25. It says, he shall be broken, but he shall be broken without human means. What's interesting about that is that it means that God had to do something with him to tear him down and break him, and it wasn't by man. Right? He wasn't broken by human means. And so what happens is that Antiochus, he dies suddenly of a random sickness at the age of 51. To me, that would be God striking him down. Let's end this. Verse 26, and the vision of the evenings and mornings which was told is true. Therefore seal up the vision, for it refers to many days in the future. The phrase, the vision of evenings and mornings, describes a period when this vision would be fulfilled, which was 4 centuries later in 167 to 164 BC, and it speaks of the future Antichrist. And Daniel must seal the vision because of its impact on prophecy, and we see him sealing it up by recording it here. In verse 27, last verse, says, I, Daniel, fainted and was sick for days. Afterward I arose and went about the king's business, and I was astonished by the vision, but no one understood it. It impacted him so much that he fainted and was sick for days. But he could not possibly understand the magnitude or even the specifics of all the vision because he lived in the Babylonian period. And it's almost like this, I think we wish God would reveal to us what the future would be, but I think we wouldn't fully understand or even believe it. And I think that's why God doesn't reveal everything to us, in our lives, that, hey, this is what's going to happen in 40 years in your life. We wouldn't believe it. We wouldn't trust it. We wouldn't even understand it. And so I think that's one reason he doesn't do that for us, and the other reason is so that we would just trust him day by day by day, step by step. So that way when we do get 40 years in the future, we look back and we're like, wow, God, you took me on the craziest of paths. If you'd have told me this 40 years ago, I wouldn't have believed it. Daniel couldn't fully understand it because he was in his Babylonian time. And so he goes about the king's business after the vision. And Jesus says this to us as Christians because he sees all this and it impacts him pretty hard. Jesus says in Luke 19:13, occupy until I come. So for us as Christians, we know these things to come, but we have to carry on with our responsibilities. Even though we may be living in the last days, we must live our lives as unto the Lord. And I'll end with this. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 14 and 15, it says, for the love of Christ compels us, because we judge thus, that if one died for all, then all died, and he died for all, so that those who live should live no longer for themselves, but for him who died for them and rose again. We must occupy until he comes. We are hopeful that he's going to come. But until that time, no matter what transpires, we're going to continue being hopeful. We're going to continue going about our business. And we are no longer going to live for ourselves, but we're going to live for him and glorify him in everything that we do. And we have so much hope and so much peace because we know who's in control.